Welcome, everyone. It's 1 p.m. Eastern. We're going to get started. Thank you for attending, participating in this webinar. It's a part two of a three-part series reviewing PERF's recent report on collecting use of force data. Actually, as many of you probably know, our first part was on Tuesday. We'll have a recording of that and be able to provide that, I believe, on the website. And then part three is going to be at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So as a quick overview of what we're going to touch on, obviously just about us and some quick and not but important acknowledgements. We're also going to highlight the importance of evidence-based policing. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a rehash from our first webinar, but when we were looking at who was registering, we saw there isn't necessarily a ton of overlap across the first two, whereas there is a good amount of overlap between the two webinars that are today, this one and then the one at 3 p.m. Eastern. So we wanted to do a quick coverage of evidence-based policing because it really is important to understanding the whole kind of scope of what types of data need to be collected, how to collect it, how to analyze it. And then obviously we'll be hitting very specifically on the PERF use of force data framework. Before we get started, some Zoom housekeeping. In the era of the pandemic, this is now a standard slide for everyone. Everyone's video and microphone disabled among attendees. So the only way we're going to be able to interact is using textual means. So we're asking that you use the Q&A button to submit questions, and you can do that at any time. We'll be cycling back to them and trying to answer as many as we can at the end. In the Q&A, you can also upvote questions. So if someone asks a really good question, you read it and you go, hey, I have that question too, feel free to upvote it, and that'll help us actually prioritize some of the questions that we try to answer. There's also a capability to comment on a question. So if you have something that you think is useful or interesting in response, feel free to put that in the Q&A as well. Please use the chat window to highlight any potential technical issues or share some basic information that's separate from any questions being asked. And as I mentioned up front for our first webinar, this one will also, it's being recorded, and the idea is that we're going to post it on the website likely after all the webinars are over. So about us, my name is Sean Goodison. I'm Deputy Director and Senior Research Criminologist here at PERF. Been at PERF a little more than 7 years now. My PhD from University of Maryland College Park, and I also, before coming to PERF, was a law enforcement analyst, civilian researcher for Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police. And across my 15 plus years of doing this sort of stuff, I've done a lot of independent work with numerous law enforcement agencies, collecting data, doing analysis, digging into files, coding stuff, all those types of things. I've also worked directly for various levels of government during this, local, state, and federal, on all sorts of data issues and data recommendations. I'll pass it to my colleague for his introduction.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Jeremy Barnum. I'm a Senior Research Associate with PERF. I've been here for about 4 years now. I earned a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Michigan State University, a master's degree in criminal justice from Rutgers University, Newark. I also spent 5 years working on my PhD at Rutgers University, Newark, and spent time as a project manager at the Rutgers Center on Public Security. So for the past 10 years or so, I've been working with law enforcement agencies at local and state levels to carry out research and analyze data.
Great. Now let's move on to our short but important acknowledgements. This is all part of a larger project looking at precursors to force, and is funded by the Charles Koch Institute. So we're very grateful for their support for this project. We We also want to thank our expert panel who helped in guiding some of the research that we consulted for this project. And that includes Steve Bishop at Dallas PD, Lori Friedel at the University of South Florida, Bill Terrell at Arizona State University, and Rob Warden at SUNY Albany. Also want to thank the PERF Research Advisory Board, currently chaired by Ed McGuire at Arizona State University. They provide a lot of important feedback and comments on some drafts of the report in which these webinars are based off of. And finally, I want to thank my research team. You're hearing from Jeremy and me right now, but we're certainly not the only ones who are involved in this. And I want to give a webinar shout out to some of the individuals. So Rachel Arietti, Elizabeth Berger, Adam Cass, Adam Kemmerer, Tatiana Lloyd-Dada, and Sierra Sitar. So again, first we want to cover a little bit about evidence-based policing because it really is foundational to kind of thinking about how to use science and research and data and apply analysis to problems in policing. And from our perspective, evidence-based policing has to be a guiding principle for agencies. And what this ends up meaning is using science to inform police decision-making in order to provide the best possible public service. And this type of philosophy is really important to establish a culture where an agency can collect, analyze, and use data effectively and efficiently. And evidence-based policing, it means having science available to provide advice and background on some current challenges faced by police executives. So what we're saying is science should be a part of executive decisions, along with other types of factors. So human intelligence, experience, community concerns, legal authority, all other sources of information and knowledge. So it doesn't mean just following the numbers in a deterministic fashion. It does mean allowing and having scientific research a seat at the table when decisions are made. And incorporating evidence-based policing is important because it demonstrates the value and role of science within an agency. And it's going to be really difficult, honestly, to collect meaningful data and develop useful analyses unless there is this type of culture or buy-in looking towards science as a part of the decision-making process and be part of that process in a systemic way. It can't just be one-off. It has to be something that's almost part of the DNA. And as I noted, the idea is not simply, okay, well, we just listen to whatever the science says and follow numbers. There are limits to the science, and it's simply there to be a part to provide that top level public service that policing is designed to do and hoping to do. So a lot of that was high level thought, but what does that actually mean for law enforcement? Well, scientific study comes in many forms. So evidence-based policing is not solely about experiments and numbers and statistics, though that obviously plays a major role potentially. But bringing science to policing can also mean using the research literature to inform current practices, which was the topic of our first webinar on Tuesday, or having a plan when building data and developing metrics for measurement, which is more of what certainly this webinar and the next step later at 3 p.m. looking at analysis, what those are going to focus on. And it's important to remember that having evidence isn't an all or nothing proposition. It's just like a police investigation, really. Some pieces of evidence are going to be stronger than others, or you can have evidence pointing in different directions. But at the end of the day, you wouldn't charge a suspect without at least considering all the available information. It's the same principle here. And of course, the evidence has to be usable. Externally, what that means is literature may need to be deciphered a bit or tailored to some problems. And again, that was kind of our focus of the first webinar on Tuesday, looking at the research on use of force. But then internally, and that's where today's webinar and the webinar later going to hit on. It means having evidence that helps make necessary decisions about strategy and deployment with data and with analysis. And this is a diagram of evidence-based policing from Larry Sherman, a very well-known and well-established policing researcher. And you see that ultimately the best goal is to have the best evidence possible. And the literature, which is research, outside research, that's going to play a role. That was the stuff in our first webinar. But then there's a whole loop that's thinking about, well, how do you gain evidence and build evidence internal to your agency? You need guidelines. You need to figure out what your outputs are. You need to measure these things. You need to look at them, how they apply in-house. That contributes to the best evidence. So that loop that you see, that's really what we're going to be touching on both in this webinar and then the one at 3 p.m. So it's relatively easy to incorporate strategy and tactics that are seen in the literature. And really the main challenge is being able to translate that. Some of the research jargon to some practical guidance, knowing what's good research versus bad. And that's where there are a lot of resources available. PERF can help with this, IACP, National Police Foundation, American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. If you're not familiar, definitely check them out. They are practitioners who have a spirit and a talent for research. They certainly can provide some help and guidance in thinking about what literature is out there. There are also other options. The federal government has National Institute of Justice, has crime solutions. The UK College of Policing has a really interesting toolkit that looks at what works in policing. And also George Mason University has their Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. And this is not even a wholly expansive slide. There are other resources out there, but that's kind of your first step in thinking about evidence-based policing. And just to show you very quickly what some of these look like, crime solutions, it's organized by topic. There's law enforcement, you can search within programs or practices. There's a lot of good information there, same with the UK College of Policing. And the benefit to this, and this is a grab from the George Mason site. The benefit here is that experts are looking at study quality, are looking at all the details and particulars, and then they're passing along the ones that are the good examples with practical translations. And actually just go back to the UK College of Policing. One of the things I really like about this one is that you see a category on there that says what it costs. And that's something that sometimes does unfortunately goes unsaid. Oh, hey, this program's really great, but it's incredibly expensive. Or you want to find a program that's pretty good, but you don't have a lot of resources, right? So that's an important factor as well. Just again, resources that exist that can be really helpful. So that's the literature side. And again, that was kind of what we touched on primarily in terms of use of force in our first webinar. What we're going to be doing today in both webinars is looking at the data, which is kind of right for this webinar, and analysis, which is the next webinar. You're going to need to look internally. That's going to be tailoring your efforts, see if programs are working, get a better idea of what's going on. And for that, you're going to need good internal practices regarding data and analysis. And the goal is what's stated right there, making good decisions based on the best available evidence. So it's really important to note, sometimes the decision will be consistent with current research, but sometimes it won't. And sometimes research may not even have a lot to contribute. However, the incorporation of science into decision-making in that systemic process allows for police to provide the best possible public service using all available sources of information when making choices. So that'll help determine not just what works, but can help figure out why it works too. And both of those questions, the what and the why, are important for future strategy. And addressing similar concerns, identifying things you might want to change or tweak, all those sort of things. And what it boils down to is that you need to be able to measure things before you can manage them. And I kind of close out this thought, research is kind of like a home cooked meal, right? And it's not a very good happy meal. And that's not to slam Happy Meals, because Happy Meals are they're good, they're quick. They get you from, you're on the road and you need to get, something in you to get you to the next meal, to the next mile stop. And Happy Meal, that's where it's at. But just like any doctor would tell you, you're not supposed to live on Happy Meals. Research is going to be a little bit of that home cooked meal. It's going to be balanced. It's going to take some preparation. It's going to take some time, but it also will get quicker with practice. And also important is that you need a decent chef for that. So it's going to take people who have some degree of training or background, that type of thing. And one final resource on evidence-based policing I wanted to pass along. There's a primer on it, and it's written specifically for police executives and practitioners. Comes out through the National Institute of Justice, and the author is Dr. Gary Cordner. He's currently the Academic Director of Education and Training for the Baltimore Police Department. It's really an excellent resource. Covers about 45 topics, and most in less than a single page. I think the first one is just about evidence-based policing, and that may be like a page and a half, 2 pages. Everything else is going to be a page. But if you look at the publication, there's 100 and something pages in it. How's that math working out? Well, it's because it's filled with extensive resources and sidebars and all sorts of information. So it's really good. We have a link here, and obviously in our published report, we provide a link to it as well. This is what the cover will look like when you see it. So if you pull up the PDF and this is the cover, then you know you came to the right place. So what we're going to talk about and go into more detail on is looking at the PERF use of force data framework. And it goes back to the point that I just made. You can only manage what you measure. So if you ask yourself, hey, do I want to manage use of force incidents in my agency? And the answer should be yes. That means you need to measure them, and you need to do it well. Because sometimes what's even worse than having no measurements are having bad measurements. Or measurements that were faulty, and then you get burned on the back end for. So in order to manage, you're going to need both data and analysis. The PERF data framework, we're thinking about data regarding use of force. Again, 3 p.m., we'll be thinking about analysis with some use of force data. And when it comes to use of force and other topics as well, but certainly use of force, agencies are sitting on a treasure trove of data. The Washington Post, media, anything else, it's not going to rival kind of the rich detail that an individual agency has. So you want to be able to tap into that source, because all that information are things that you can use. You want to maximize the potential of all the data that you have. But the challenge, what we've seen, is that it often lacks kind of a systematic framework. It may be hodgepodge. It may be just don't know what to ask or what to think of. You need a starting point. You need that framework to jump off from, to go, okay, well, at least we have this in our back pocket. We can move on from this. We can adapt it. We can tailor it. We can do all that sort of stuff. And that's going to be important for transparency, because the more information that you can systematically collect and vet and process and then use for your decision making in good, reasonable, responsible ways, that's putting all the cards on the table. And that has benefits beyond simply getting the information, especially when we're talking about use of force, where there's obviously quite a large public thought and sentiment to understanding these types of things. And I just want to add quickly, tied into that, obviously, I hope everyone listening knows that the FBI is coordinating a national use of force data collection. And if you read our report, and you'll hear it from me now, we wholly and absolutely recommend that agencies submit to that. And what you'll find, and Jeremy is going to talk a little bit about this, but what you're going to find is that the data the FBI are looking for. It's going to provide a bit more context and a bit more detail to use of force, but it's also not enough for you as an individual in an agency to fully maximize. You have more information than the FBI is asking for, and that's good because it's a national collection, and it's very difficult to get a wide amount of the same amount of information that you have individually in an agency. But what you want to do is maximize your data, and we'll be talking about that also when it comes to analysis. But that's the goal: maximizing your data, tapping into everything that you have, because that's going to help you determine, evaluate your policies, your programs, because this is ultimately about your agency and the analysis of your data. You're the shepherds of it, you have it. We just want to be able to set up a framework and help you be able to tease out as much as you can so that you can, as I've said, provide that best possible public service. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Jeremy Barnum. He's going to cover some of the mechanics of the use of force framework. I also will, just as we're transitioning and he's getting ready to share his screen, I just want to remind everyone, please feel free to use the Q&A to put in questions, to upvote, whatever the case may be. We'll be cycling back to them following the presentation. We'll be trying to hit to as many of those as we can. So with that said, I'm going to pass it to Jeremy.
All right, so as a way to help agencies build new or improve their existing use of force data collection programs, we developed essentially what just amounts to a list of factors that could influence use of force and also guidance on how to measure those factors. So this is what we're calling our use of force data framework. So the framework's based on a few different sources. So that would be first and foremost our review of the research literature, the factors that have been studied before. We also got feedback from our expert panel, which included both practitioners and researchers who have studied policing and use of force specifically. Some of the variables are directly from the FBI's National Use of Force Data Collection Program and the specifications for their database. And then, of course, our own experience at PERF working directly with law enforcement agencies to review their use of force data and make policy recommendations. So we put a link here, and these webinars will be available on our website, so you can click it anytime you want. But if you want to download the framework as an Excel file, you just go to this site that's listed here. All right. Now, included in the framework are more than 150 officer, subject, and situational factors, those grouping of factors that we talked about in our first webinar, that could be related to use of force. So 150 factors. This is, of course, a lot of data. But what we wanted to do was be comprehensive here. We wanted to create essentially what a wish list of factors that could influence use of force would be. Things that agencies might want to know about and things that agencies probably should know about their use of force incidents. So it's a really good starting point and source of information for agencies that are in the planning or development phase of a use of force data collection program and trying to figure out what variables they want to collect and how to do it. But it's also a great resource for agencies that are a little more along the way and already have a use of force data collection program in place and want to expand it in different ways. So ideally, agencies would lean toward collecting information on as many factors as possible, so that way they can better track and understand their use of force incidents. So a good starting point with the framework that we recommend is a self-assessment. So you can download the framework, take a look at the factors, and you can kind of rate yourself on how many of these factors does our agency collect and how many are we missing. And then we also want to start thinking about how do we collect this data? How do we store it? Is it accessible and easily leveraged for analysis? Because that's a really important point as well. Then you can use the framework as a guide for future collection, depending on what's feasible and relevant for your agency. It's also important to keep in mind, though, that you're not always going to be able to collect everything, or you might not want to collect everything, so you can prioritize what you do collect. So the minimum starting point that we recommend is collecting the data on factors that are included in the FBI's National Use of Force database. So these measures will already account for a significant amount of the context, important context behind use of force incidents, but they will also facilitate, make it easier for you to submit your data to the FBI database, which again, we strongly recommend because it helps us develop a better knowledge about prevalence and also factors in predicting use of force, not just in one or two agencies, but nationally. So another option is to use the research literature as a guide for what data to collect beyond what's in the FBI database, for example, if that's your starting point. And so we especially recommend focusing on factors where the evidence appears to be mixed or less clear, because those are the factors we just don't know a whole lot about yet, and we'll probably want to learn more about to inform our policy. Finally, and this should be a part of any strategy, of course, in the law enforcement world, agencies can in fact assess which factors are not only most important to them internally and organizationally, but what factors might matter to their community. All right, so let's take a look at the framework itself. It's shown here. When you open it up, it'll look something like this, essentially just a long list of factors. And of course, this is a screenshot, so it's not comprehensive, but you'll have a lot of scrolling to do to get to the bottom. So you'll see the first column on the left lists the name of each factor. The second column displays an example set of attribute values that you might want to include for that factor, or how it should be operationalized, as we call it. So this could be a numerical value, such as age or years of experience or past number of complaints or accommodations. Could be something like a binary value, a yes, no, or a 1-0 to reflect the presence or absence of that factor in a given encounter. So was the subject experiencing homelessness? Was there a supervisor on scene? Were there bystanders present? Or it could be a categorical variable and include several different variables, like officer rank. So you might have officer, sergeant, detective, lieutenant, so on and so forth. So it'll be a decision that has to be made. The same factor could be operationalized in a number of different ways. The most important point is it obviously needs to be valid and reliable, and also meaningful and feasible. There's a balance between collecting as much information as possible so you can learn as much as you can about that variable, but it also needs to be practical for example, the officers that are in the field that are having to write those reports. So what we provide in the framework are simply suggestions based on what we've seen done by previous studies, by other agencies, or specifications pulled from the FBI's data collection program. So the third column here defines each factor and provides some additional guidance or context for that factor. So some factors are quite straightforward, such as the date the use of force incident happened. Not much to say about that. But other factors are a little more complex or complicated to think about. So one factor we see frequently in the literature is evidence of a crime. In other words, how much evidence existed during the encounter that the subject committed a crime. The theory behind that being that if there's more evidence of a crime, officers may feel more legally justified to use force, and so it might be more likely. So this is typically measured using an index based on different things that are worth different points, like the subject gave a full or partial confession. Was there physical evidence of the crime present? Were there witnesses? So obviously there's a little more that goes into creating this variable. So we explain that and provide a citation to the source it was pulled from for more follow-up. Even use of force itself can be very difficult when we're talking about a use of force encounter. Of course, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the highest level of force used? Are we trying to measure all the uses of force that happened? Are we trying to measure the sequence of force that happened? So you can measure all of those, you can measure some of those. It's a decision that has to be made. The fourth column here on the right suggests where agencies might already capture information about the factors listed in the framework. So it could be your use of force reports. It could be certain columns in the use of force report. It could be narrative, it could be CAD reports, it could be arrest reports, so on and so forth. So in general, factors are listed into officer, subject, and situational factors. again, based on what's been done in the literature. But what we've also included and what you're looking at here is a section on administrative information or general information about a use of force incident, things like case number, date and time, the type of force, things that are not necessarily predictors, but are still important information about a use of force incident that you'd want to collect information on. So now what you're seeing here are officer factors. These are shaded in blue. And so each grouping of factors is shaded a different color to sort of break those up. So it's a little easier to kind of digest. One important point about officer factors and also subject factors is that the variables that we list in here, the factors that we list, should be collected for each officer that used force at least, and each subject who had force used on them that occurred in the encounter. So you'll see here, if you look to the left column, you see all the officer factors are labeled with an O1, and we reference a primary officer. Of course, this could also mean different things, and that's another decision that has to be made when you're collecting your data. But does that mean the first officer that was on scene? Does it mean the officer that used the highest level of force? It's a decision that needs to be made. It's primarily referenced because if you're collecting the data on all officers that were involved, you'll have it anyways, so you can analyze it. But by collecting data on everyone that was involved in that incident, we can better represent and understand the context behind what happened and what factors may be playing an important role there. So, and just to show you, this is what your subject factors would look like. They're shaded in yellow. And then you have situational factors as well. So in many cases, as our fourth column on source might suggest, it's likely that a lot of agencies are collecting some or a lot of this data on the factors that are listed here already. But collecting data is more data as much as possible is usually a good thing and can help us learn more about why our use of force occurs and what we can do to reduce and prevent it. We can also have that data available to help us evaluate any efforts that we engage in to reduce use of force and prevent it, to make sure they're effective and working as intended. But as Sean had referenced earlier, it's not always just about more data, but we want better data as well. So even if agencies have data on all the factors listed in this framework, it's not going to help us out a whole lot if it's not collected in a way that's meaningful or stored in a way that's able to be leveraged in a practical way. So we just have a few high-level recommendations for collecting better data based on kind of our experiences working with use of force data. So first and foremost would be to collect and store that data in an electronic database to make it more accessible. Some agencies already do this, but other ones still rely on paper reports or scanned PDF reports. So when it comes to analysis, paper reports, they have to be read, they have to be manually coded into a database. It's incredibly resource intensive and often not really practical as a result. Sort of relatedly, as much as possible, we want to collect data on specific variables as much as possible, rather than through narrative accounts. Narrative accounts are typically a pretty rich source of information, but again, they can make analysis challenging because they need to be read and coded. They also need to be interpreted. So they rely on officers to relay information about key factors in a clear, accurate, and standardized way. And of course, things can get lost in translation. Officers may forget to reference things that were present and important, but they might not have included those in the narratives. So we want to include those specific factors in the reports as much as possible. Finally, we want to assure data. So some data might be stored in many different places throughout the agency. So in our experience, we've seen relevant use of force data stored in RMS, CAD, arrest reports, use of force reports, records held by Office of Professional Standards, Human Resources. Depends on what data you're looking at, but it can be in many different places throughout the agency. That's fine. You don't need to store it all in one place, but you do want to have it all in one place when you analyze it. So it's really important to have key common identifiers in there, like officers' badge numbers and case numbers so that they can easily be linked up in a quick and efficient way to be analyzed. That's all I have, so I will go ahead and open it up for questions.
Great. And Jeremy, could you keep sharing your screen just so everyone has our contact information? I just wanted to, I'm going to go start looking at some of the chat. There are a lot of good questions that are being asked, and we want to try to address them in the time that we have remaining. So going into the chat, seeing a lot of upvotes for a good question from Bob. What are the types of force should be measured? And a number of examples: deadly force, serious bodily injury, less lethal. What about pointing firearm or taser? As Jeremy kind of just hit on, really the more data, the better. And the reason why we're saying more data is not from an academic standpoint of, hey, we really want to see a lot of your data. This is more about agencies being able to collect and maximize what they have. So ultimately, it's going, if an agency is looking to collect data, it'll be an agency decision as to what they should, what they should collect on, what types of force, how you break them down. And that's going to differ somewhat between agencies. That's why, as we're thinking about a framework here, we're trying to think of the broad structure. Here's kind of a giant universe of things that that agencies can collect. How you want to collect them, we give suggestions, we give options based on what we've seen in the past, what other agencies have done as best practices, but ultimately it's going to be on an agency what they want to collect, what they want to know. And the more that you're going to be able to collect in a systematic way, I think the better off an agency can be when we get to effectively the next webinar, which is going to be talking about analysis. Jeremy, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that question.
Yeah, it does come down to being an agency decision, but I guess I'll flash my researcher bias and say try to collect as much information as possible because we can understand it better. So, if you're only collecting data on the most serious forms of force, that's what you're going to be able to learn about, which is fine. But as we know, the less serious, air quotes, forms of force are much more frequent. So that's probably where we want to focus our prevention efforts if we want to reduce our overall level of force. I do see in the question that there's a point about pointing a firearm or taser. So there's fewer studies on that, but there are some out there. And I believe they show, if I remember correctly, that there's some evidence that requiring officers to document firearm pointing may reduce force. So that's something to think about. And then another point is that if you collect data on more forms of force, especially those lower forms of force, and then all the forces that happen in between, starting from the lowest to the highest, and all the ones that occur in a given event, really opens you up to being able to study the sequence of how force unfolds in a given encounter. So sometimes it's very fast. Officers have to enter a situation. It's very dangerous, and they have to use whatever level of force to stop it. But sometimes situations unfold more slowly over time. And it's, it's not an area of research that's been studied a whole lot yet, but probably an important area of research to figure out how force unfolds over time, especially when the ones that unfold over time, there's a lot more opportunity to hopefully prevent it from escalating.
There are a few questions in here. I see Reggie has one talking about helping determine if use of force was within policy or excessive, and I saw another question about tying into predictive policing and various other questions that are outcomes, and I kind of want to partially address them now and partially punt on them. And the punting is because a lot of these questions, they they end up being analysis type questions, which is going to be for our next webinar. Because when we're thinking about collecting the data, collecting the data is in some ways an agnostic and sterile process. We want to have you want to have a framework, you want to have categories, you want to establish how this is being measured, and there are a few questions also they're asking who's entering in this data and whatnot. And kind of our thinking is that in part it can be done either if there's a type of records division or individuals who are focused on that, but then also that's going to be touched on in our analysis webinar, the various partnerships that exist that could help build and develop this type of database at very limited and potentially no outward cost. But I did want to hit that, when it comes to using the data, and let's say, we want to determine if a use of force is within policy, or if we want to test the how predictive or proactive or any type of policing is used, we need the data. But then that next question, that's an analysis question. That's how do you look at the data? And I think that goes towards the point that Jeremy was just mentioning, and that if you collect more data, you can kind of maximize your potential answers and how you explore those types of questions. Because think about any of those questions, thinking about whether it's excessive force or it's dealing with predictive policing. If you don't have the information, then you're not going to really be able to make a good determination. And these are complex instances, these are complex questions. So that's why we're advocating that we need more data in this framework. And again, thinking about how agencies could collect it, how they could start to think about it. This isn't something that I think everyone will just, you just jump in and you can just turn it on and go. But this framework is kind of it's a free editable framework. The structure of your database is kind of right there. I wanted to address, I think we'll probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. And I saw there's a question about the FBI and their database and kind of the focus there. And just wanted to hit on that too, because we do recommend that agencies submit data to the FBI National Collection, and our framework is based in part on that. So if a hypothetical agency were to take kind of this current PERF framework and apply it as much as they can, and understanding that there's a lot of data fields in here. In some ways, it's kind of a wish list, right? It's these are all the things in an ideal world that you would want to know tied into use of force. But that doesn't mean every agency could even collect them. I mean, I suspect that agencies have a lot more of this information. They're buried in narratives. They're buried in other sources, which are good sources, but they're not easily searchable. They're not easily able to turn around to give you, some quick information about these types of things. But back to the FBI, I mean, it's the question, what do agencies get out of it, right? Well, at least from our perspective, first, it's the ability to use data to help the profession in the future. Because the information that the FBI receives, it has a lot of context, and it's going to be able to put things in kind of a different light, in a different framework, and it's going to be, far and away, superior in terms of data to the media or other attempts, many other attempts to collect comprehensive national use of force data. And also it's something where if more agencies are participating, there's more flexibility in how the data is released. And we're going to talk a little bit about this also in the analysis part, where you want to be able to have a representative set of data so that you can put things, put findings or results out there and feel confident that, yeah, this is an actual national snapshot, rather than, yeah, this is a snapshot of 20% of agencies across the country. That's not very useful, but it's going to take more agencies to submit. And I also think that touching into what we said before with transparency, submitting to the FBI, it gets your community to start to understand, you're volunteering this information, and in part an interest of transparency, because kind of as I mentioned before, thinking about the treasure trove of data that agencies have, I said shepherd. You're the shepherd of the data, because it's ultimately it's the community's data. It's a public service. It's public information to some extent. Obviously private information is private information, but the thing is, you can build some type of additional trust by submitting this type of data, especially on a topic that's really kind of important and influential. And the more agencies that do it, the more they're going to be able to release and put out better context of what happens during use of force incidents. I'll ask Jeremy if he has any comments on that, and then I think we're probably going to run up on time, unfortunately.
No, I think those are all really good points. I would just want to hit on another point that I saw down here about, how much is this going to cost, and how are we expected to have officers enter this information? And we realize that there's a logistical challenge to collecting this data, right? We know not everything's going to be possible. We will say that vendors are getting a lot better in terms of the databases that they build and their usability. So that's a nice thing to look forward to. Some agencies already use some really good stuff that's out there and publish a lot of really good data on use of force on their websites. But taking steps to collect data on some of the more important variables is a really good step in the right direction. And there's also going to have to be some partnerships involved, which we'll get into our next webinar. But something like collecting data on the force sequence, right? That's going to be really tough to document for an officer to think back on, what forces did I use? What sequence did I use them? So you might need to partner with a researcher on that one and find different ways of collecting the data through systematic social observation, which we mentioned in our first webinar, where you have trained researchers with officers taking notes on what's happening during an encounter. But what's even more of a promising avenue for future research is using body-worn cameras. As agencies start to adopt those, you can watch use of force encounters as they happen, code them, and collect really rich data on them that previously wasn't accessible to the field or researchers.
Thanks, Jeremy. Unfortunately, that is the time that we have for this. I want to thank everyone for both listening and for asking some really great questions. We tried to hit as many as we could. Obviously, we have our contact information up there. So if there are additional questions or concerns, complaints, issues, you know where to find us. We're not hiding. And hopefully it's been of interest to you, and we'll be having our final webinar later today in just about it looks like an hour and 12 minutes on analysis, which I think is going to hit some of the things, as I mentioned, that were kind of asked in the questions. So we hope to see you then. Thank you, and have a good day.